August 1st, 1944. Morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Brittany Peninsula, France. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel exhaust, thick around the small villages and fortified hedgerows. You can almost hear the soft clatter of hooves and the distant rumble of engines warming up. In a dimly lit command tent outside Rents, several Wehrmacht generals leaned over a map, fingers tracing roads that Patton's Third Army was rumored to take. General Erich Brandenburger smirked. "He'll never break through there," he muttered, voice laced with barely contained amusement. Colonel von Hagen chuckled, shaking his head. "Sherman tanks in that terrain, it's madness." They were confident, overconfident. Meanwhile, a few hundred miles to the east, Major General Jeffrey Keyes was briefing the armored column. Sherman tanks gleamed in the pale morning light, their crews buzzing with anticipation. You could see the gleam off the metal barrels, hear the engines growl like restless lions. Patton himself strode past, his polished boots crunching over the gravel, eyes sharp, calculating. His men sensed it, something audacious was about to unfold. By midday, Patton's units began moving. The 4th Armored Division surged through narrow lanes, hedgerows whipping past like ghostly green walls. Artillery crews set up positions, and mechanized infantry clattered alongside, ready to exploit any opening. And yet, back in the German command tent, the generals laughed. They could not imagine that this reckless push would tear through their defenses faster than any intelligence report had predicted. But the first skirmishes along the Pontivy road hinted at a different reality. Small German outposts, meant to slow Patton's advance, were being bypassed entirely. M4 Sherman tanks moved in unexpected corridors, capturing crossroads the Germans considered impassable. German officers received frantic radio reports. Orders to regroup and reinforce came too late, misaligned with the rapid American movement. The laughter began to fade. By nightfall, reconnaissance planes spotted Patton's forces approaching St. Brieuc, a key port the Wehrmacht thought secure. From their tent, the general's smirks had vanished, replaced by frowns and muttered curses. "How?" Brandenburger whispered, eyes darting across the map. The armored column had done what seemed impossible. It had outflanked every fortified position without heavy losses, slicing through what was supposed to be an impenetrable defensive web. And yet the night was far from over. Somewhere ahead, St. Brieuc waited, heavily defended. Patton's audacity was about to be tested, and the Germans had no idea the storm coming their way. August 2nd, 1944. Dawn broke over the Brittany Hills, painting the horizon in bruised purples and golds. Mist still hung low in the valleys, and the faint smell of gunpowder lingered from yesterday's skirmishes. You could almost feel the tension in the air, thick as fog. Patton's armored column was moving like a living thing, tanks rolling in precise formations, half-tracks rattling over cobblestones, infantry keeping pace alongside. Sergeant James McAllister of the 4th Armored Division wiped sweat from his brow, scanning the hedgerows. "Sir, they didn't expect us here," he muttered to his lieutenant, voice barely audible over the engine growl. And he was right. The Germans hadn't expected anyone to navigate the narrow lanes, river crossings, and dense woods with such speed. Meanwhile, in a reinforced German stronghold near Pontivy, Colonel von Hagen barked orders at his officers. "Stop them at any cost," he demanded, frustration sharpening his voice. Trenches were manned, artillery positioned, machine gun nests bristling. But Patton wasn't playing by the expected rules. His tanks rolled past fortified chokepoints, bypassing resistance and leaving confused German units isolated in their own defensive lines. In the chaos, a platoon of Sherman tanks cut through a small village, their treads crushing barricades and hedgerows. Local French civilians peeked from shattered windows, whispering in awe as the American armor seemed to appear from nowhere. A German patrol attempted to mount a counterattack, only to find themselves boxed in. Radio messages crackled urgently. "Enemy bypassing our positions. Reinforcements needed immediately." By midday, Patton's forces reached the outskirts of St. Brieuc. From the German command tent, A stunned silence replaced the laughter that had filled the previous day. Generals pored over their maps, tracing Patton's path again and again, trying to comprehend how an American force had maneuvered with surgical precision through terrain they had considered impossible to traverse. Brandenburger slammed his fist on the table. This isn't supposed to happen," he muttered. And yet Patton pressed on. He wasn't content to simply advance. He aimed to break the enemy's will. Infantry and armor coordinated flawlessly, encircling German positions, cutting supply lines, and isolating units before they could regroup. Every radio transmission from the Wehrmacht carried panic, disbelief, and the first glimmers of fear. As the sun began to dip, the Third Army's advance had left German defenses in tatters, scattered and leaderless. For the first time, the generals who had laughed now stared at their maps in horror, realizing that their own strategic assumptions had been shattered. Patton wasn't just moving through Brittany, he was rewriting the rules of armored warfare in real time. But the final confrontation at the key port was still ahead, and the German command was scrambling. Could the Third Army capture St. Brieuc before reinforcements arrived? Or would the Wehrmacht regroup and turn the tide? August 3, 1944. Early morning lights spilled over the jagged coastline near St. Brieuc, glinting off the steel of Sherman tanks and the green helmets of infantrymen. The distant boom of artillery echoed through the valleys, mixing with the cries of birds startled from hedgerows. You can almost feel the tension, the hum of engines, and the quiet dread settling over the German ranks. Patton's strategy was simple in appearance but devastating in execution: speed, surprise, and total encirclement. The 6th Armored Division split off from the main column, swinging west to cut the Germans' retreat to the port. Mechanized infantry moved to seal the northern approaches. Roads once thought impassable now funneled fleeing Wehrmacht units directly into the jaws of the Americans. Inside the German command bunker, chaos reigned. Colonel von Hagen's officers shouted over each other, radio lines jammed with panic transmissions. "They've bypassed our eastern fortifications. Redeploy immediately." But orders were too slow, movements too constrained. Every maneuver the Germans attempted was anticipated, neutralized by Patton's relentless advance. Out in the field, Lieutenant Robert Chambers watched as his Sherman tank rolled into a clearing. Before him, a column of German trucks tried to flee, but the Americans had anticipated this escape route. Within minutes, the enemy vehicles were surrounded. Soldiers jumped from their trucks, surrendering, disarmed, or captured by infantry units racing along flanks. Patton's men moved almost like a single organism, cutting off avenues of escape with terrifying efficiency. Back in the German tent, the generals were pale, some gripping their maps as if sheer force could undo the nightmare unfolding outside. Brandenburger's earlier smirk had vanished completely. He whispered to a staff officer, voice trembling, "We underestimated him completely." Von Hagen sat back, jaw tight, staring at the radio receiver as surrender reports came in from units that should have been holding positions for days. By late afternoon, the Americans had fully encircled St. Brieuc. Patton's tanks rumbled through the streets, boots of infantrymen echoing on cobblestones. German defenders tried to mount a last-ditch resistance, but they were fragmented, leaderless, and demoralized. Each passing hour saw the Third Army tightening the noose, cutting off food, ammunition, and communication. And somewhere in the chaos, Patton stood atop a Sherman, surveying the city with piercing eyes. "Move fast, strike hard, leave nothing for them to regroup," he barked. His officers knew better than to argue. Every decision he had made in the past weeks, the audacious flanking, the bypassing of fortified positions, the relentless pursuit, was culminating now. The generals' disbelief had turned into dread. Their own defenses had been turned against them, their calculations shattered by an American general whose audacity knew no bounds. And yet, the capture of St. Brieuc wasn't complete. The city's harbor still held German supplies, and pockets of resistance threatened to slow the Third Army's momentum. Patton's next move would either cement his reputation as a tactical genius or plunge his men into unexpected peril. August 4, 1944. The sun rose over Brittany like a cold spotlight, illuminating smoke curling from shattered villages and the jagged remains of destroyed German vehicles. The once proud Wehrmacht units, scattered and demoralized, were scrambling to salvage what little order remained. You can almost hear the frenzied footsteps of officers, the rattle of abandoned weapons, and the distant roar of Sherman engines closing in. Inside the German command tent, silence had replaced laughter. Maps were crumpled, pens broken in frustration. Brandenburger ran a trembling hand over his forehead. "They've broken us," he admitted to von Hagen, voice barely above a whisper. Each incoming radio message confirmed the nightmare. Entire battalions cut off, supply lines severed, fortified positions bypassed. The Wehrmacht's plans for Brittany were unraveling faster than anyone could comprehend. Meanwhile, Patton's forces pushed deeper into St. Brieuc. Infantry squads moved from street to street, clearing German defenders who refused to surrender. Tanks rolled through key intersections, their engines growling like beasts, their presence alone breaking the enemy's morale. Behind every hedgerow, the Third Army's mechanized units coordinated with surgical precision, cutting escape routes and capturing artillery positions intact. A group of German officers attempted to rally a last defensive stand near the harbor. They hoped to hold the Americans long enough to evacuate critical supplies, but they underestimated the Third Army's coordination. Within minutes, Sherman tanks flanked their position, infantry encircled the perimeter, and the officers were forced to surrender. Desperate cries echoed off the cobblestones, swallowed by the relentless advance of American forces. Patton observed from a command vehicle, cigar smoke curling into the morning air. His eyes scanned the chaos, noting each surrendered officer, each captured artillery piece, each road now fully under Allied control. The generals who had mocked him just days earlier were now powerless, watching as their carefully laid defenses dissolved into chaos. From disbelief to awe and finally to defeat, the transformation was complete. By evening, St. Brieuc was fully in Allied hands. The city's port was secured, vital supply routes captured, and the German forces were scattered, retreating into the surrounding countryside. Patton's audacious plan had worked. He had bypassed the enemy's strongest defenses, isolated their units, and forced the collapse of an entire regional command. Yet, even in victory, the Third Army knew the campaign was far from over. Pockets of German resistance remained in Brittany, and reinforcements could still arrive from Normandy. Patton's audacity had won the battle, but the war was relentless, and the generals who had once laughed at him would be plotting revenge with whatever forces remained. August 5, 1944. The streets of St. Brieuc were quiet now, but the silence was uneasy. Smoke still rose from shattered homes, and the faint metallic tang of blood lingered in the air. You could almost hear the distant groan of abandoned vehicles, the hollow echo of boots on rubble-strewn streets, and the whispered awe of civilians peeking from broken shutters. Patton's Third Army had moved through Brittany with unprecedented speed, leaving a trail of disoriented German units in their wake. Officers who had once scoffed at the reckless American were now writing desperate reports, admitting defeat in hushed tones. General Brandenburger, usually confident and composed, sat alone in a ruined command post, staring at a map marked with the path of Patton's unstoppable advance. He muttered under his breath, "We underestimated him, every move." Back with the Americans, soldiers were exhausted but elated. Lieutenant Chambers wiped sweat from his brow, watching his men secure the harbor. "Sir, they didn't see it coming, not at all," he said, awestruck. Patton, cigar in hand, simply nodded. He didn't celebrate. He never did. Victory for him was measured not in accolades but in results, and the Third Army's momentum had to continue. The capture of Brittany's ports gave the Allies a crucial logistical advantage, opening new supply lines for the push into France. But more than that, it sent a psychological shockwave through German ranks. Generals who had mocked Patton were now terrified, their strategies disrupted, their confidence shattered. Reports from Berlin reached Hitler himself. The audacious American general had outmaneuvered some of the Wehrmacht's finest minds, leaving chaos where order had once reigned. In the villages and forests of Brittany, the civilians whispered stories of tanks appearing from impossible paths, of soldiers striking with precision and speed, of an army that seemed to move as one living organism. Patton's legend was growing, built not on propaganda but on fear, respect, and the undeniable proof of battlefield brilliance. Yet the story didn't end with St. Brieuc. Patton's audacity had set a new standard for armored warfare, forcing the Germans to rethink every defensive plan in Western Europe. And somewhere in the shadows, the generals who had laughed at him were already plotting revenge, retrenchment, and perhaps redemption in a war that was far from over. Patton's armored column had done more than break defenses. It had broken assumptions, shattered pride, and left an indelible mark on both sides of the battlefield. For the Americans, it was a triumph of speed, coordination, and audacity. For the Germans, a nightmare they would not soon forget. And